Oceans Apart, Greed, Betrayal, and Pacific Rugby. This is a documentary which I watched last week and again this week. So it's a bit of a different video today, guys, about this documentary made by the team at Pacific Rugby Players Welfare, headed by Dan Leo, former Samoa player, and advocate for all things Pacific Rugby. Firstly, I would say I do recommend this as a watch. It's like a 1 hour documentary. I think it's being distributed on a couple of different online platforms. It's on Vimeo here in New Zealand, and I think most territories, and maybe Amazon Prime in the UK. But either way, have a Google. Oceans Apart, Greed, Betrayal, and Pacific Rugby. If you're keen, it's like $6 US, $5.99 US, which was like $7 something for me here in New Zealand. And for $7 for 1 hour, I thought it was a pretty good watch. So highly recommend you go to watch this. I'll talk about kind of a few points that were brought up, my take on them. And if you guys have seen the doco, let me know what you thought about it, what you thought the kind of key takeaways were, and what you would kind of like to see more on. It seemed like it took quite a while to make. It was made, I think, from 2016 and then just released this year in 2020. It's been coming for a while, and I've seen excerpts of it before, but never kind of the full deal. And it's done basically in the format of Dan, who travels around mostly to the Pacific, to Tonga, Samoa, and Fiji, talks to different people and players, former players, current players, pundits, people at World Rugby. He gets around, kind of gets their opinions on what some of the big problems are in the Pacific and what the possible solutions are. Everyone kind of giving their opinions as to what might be the best courses of action. Kind of unsurprisingly, one of the big topics that comes up is the funding. And I think the stereotype around Pacific Rugby and the funding seems to be that there's no point funding the Pacific Rugby nations, the Pacific Rugby unions, with any kind of great set of funds because it's all corrupt and there's never going to be any development there. That seems to be the stereotype. Dan kind of addresses that a bit in the documentary. He talks to the PM of Samoa. There wasn't actually that much content in his interview with him. I kind of would have liked to seen a bit more because it was quite built up and then it ended up kind of abruptly. But they talked about having a clean audit bill for like 4 years compared to back when Dan was a player and money has seemingly been going missing. But that's a bit of a good news story. They've got a clean audit in Samoa and Rugby Union, so that seems to be a bit of improvement in the last 4 years anyway. They talk about how World Rugby's contribution to at least the Samoan Rugby Union is like 30% of their overall operating costs, which is still, it's a big chunk, but it's not the majority of it. And that rugby in Samoa is essentially, it needs government assistance, otherwise it wouldn't even get off the ground. They wouldn't be able to run their programs. And I think one of the main issues for funding in the Pacific, I think this goes maybe more across the board, seems to be that it's difficult for them to attract sponsors. I notice I've got 3 Pacific jerseys here. I've got a Tonga one, there's no sponsor. I've got a Samoa one, there's no sponsor. And you can't see it, but the Fiji one has got a Fiji Airways logo on it. So they're the only one, at least as the time of buying these jerseys, that had sponsors on them. So, I mean, virtually every nation you can think of has got a big old sponsor on the front, right? That seems to be a harder thing for the Pacific nations to attract a big sponsor. I mean, it's good that Fiji have got Fiji Airways. I'm sure they'd be getting more if it was like Qantas or, whatever. Even though Qantas is kind of pulling out of their deal with the Wallabies, but that's another point. But attracting sponsors is difficult. I don't know that there's a quick fix for that one. That just is what it is, I think. But that puts these teams already kind of one step on the back foot. The way that the revenue sharing works for test matches, essentially it doesn't get shared. If you're the host team, you keep all the money. That just seems to be the model, and I imagine that works pretty well. When England go to play Scotland, Scotland play England, or England come to New Zealand, we sell out Eden Park. Eden Park and New Zealand Rugby are pretty happy. When the All Blacks travel to Twickenham, it gets sold out and everybody's pretty happy. However, teams don't tour the Pacific that much, and when they do, they obviously have to pay in local currency, and they can't put exorbitant prices. So, the average wage in Tonga, Samoa, and Fiji is probably a lot less than what it is in the UK or New Zealand or Australia or Ireland, whatever. So it's a problem. So the kind of revenue sharing thing doesn't work. It's kind of like a one size fits all. Doesn't work for the Pacific countries. There's a suggestion maybe they could do a deal where if you're playing, it's a hard one to put like a hard and fast rule to it. Like I think they mentioned like tier 2 nations, could they get like a cut of the gate receipts? So if you go to Twickenham, get 10%, get 20%. But I mean Japan's tier 2, so Japan doesn't need the money. So I would say it would have to be done smarter than that. And where do you draw the line? Which countries do you give 20%? Which ones do you don't? I get that gets messy. Just having it 100% home keeps things simple. So yeah, but I can see that, man. That's a kind of a quick win. But I guess it's maybe harder to implement if you could get that going. And when countries, they notice if you say, well, why don't the countries just tour the Pacific more? Yeah, like I said, the people aren't going to get the same money through the gates when a game is hosted in one of these 3 countries. So, again, that's just the practicality of the economies. But, yeah, it's just, I don't know, man. It's tough. I think when they said when Samoa hosted the All Blacks a few years ago, they lost like $1 million. Because you still have to pay the airfares and whatnot of the visiting team. So, yeah. So the funding thing come to it quite a lot. The number one driver I felt was if Tonga, Samoa, Fiji are playing games abroad, if they could get a cut of the ticket sales or the broadcast deal or whatever it is, I don't know. I think it was mainly ticket sales they're talking about. That would be a quick win for Pacific Rugby. Like that's 10% of one test at the Aviva. For Ireland is probably not a huge amount, but for Tonga, Fiji, or Samoa, it could be enough to make a big difference. I like that idea. Now, selling that to the unions may be tougher. The eligibility rule was also a big one. Also a really big one. That guys like Charles Piutau, who's played for the All Blacks, he's captured by New Zealand. You can only play for one country, essentially, unless you go through the Olympic loophole. You can't change your nationality. That seems to be a big driver from, I think, multiple parties, multiple people that Dan interviewed, was that if you could change your nationality to a Pacific country that you're connected to, as an example, like Charles Piutau, then that would be a big boost for the Pacific nations. They used the rugby league as an example. We had a whole bunch of guys who played previously for the New Zealand rugby league team. They had a bit of a falling out, and they switched allegiance to Tonga, and then they had a really good World Cup run in the Rugby League World Cup. So that they used as an example. The eligibility one's a bit of a. I don't see a big, and again, every time you make an action, there's going to be unintended consequences. I don't see anything too terrible about the switching of nationality. Whether there's a stand down period. Well, they talked to World Rugby about it, who just said there's no appetite for it, and certain countries just basically seem to block it. But I don't see the big deal with this one, especially when you consider, like when they visited Tonga, they mentioned basically every year 40 schoolboys are essentially offered scholarships abroad. Like the 40 best players in Tonga are attracted abroad every year. So they're already losing their top talent. These guys go to school overseas, and eventually, if they get good enough, they represent their new country. So that kind of sucks. Yeah. So the eligibility one, I don't see. Again, tell me if there's something I'm missing. What the big harm would be in it? But I'm thinking of I've recently just watched the Autumn Nations Cup. You've seen 2 guys play for Wales, Callum Sheedy and Johnny Williams, who both played for England against the Barbarians, which is not a test match, so they got not captured by that game. But you've literally seen these guys in a full England kit playing for England, and there wasn't like a huge deal with them playing for Wales, right? I don't know. It doesn't seem like that big a deal for me. That being said, I do, as a Kiwi, I do sometimes get a little bit frustrated with the Piatau example because like he's born in New Zealand, so in my mind, like he's a Kiwi. Brad Shields was born in New Zealand, he's a Kiwi. TJ Perenara has got Māori connections, he's a Kiwi. I'm a Kiwi. Like I see, yeah, these are all Kiwis for me. But I mean, I can't put my mind like I don't know how English Brad Shields feels. I don't know how Tongan Charles Piutau feels. Does he feel more Tongan or does he feel more Kiwi because he's born and raised here, but he's got Tongan parents? I can't understand anyone's thought pattern on that. I can't put myself in somebody else's head. But if he was to play for Tonga, would I be upset about it? Nah, man. I want to see the guy play. So, again, I don't think that's a... That seems like a pretty quick win if that's going to help. Anyway. And then I talked about World Rugby. Now, World Rugby is a kind of... It's an easy one to point the finger at all the time. It's a really easy one because they are the governing body of rugby in the world. But... When we saw the campaign for like Bill Beaumont win his re-election as chairman of World Rugby against Pichot, and we saw them both interviewed, I kind of got a grasp of how they don't have control over maybe as much as we think they do. And a lot of the questions that Dan kind of posed to World Rugby is kind of like, well, we don't actually look after that. And I try to put my head around that, and it's hard to kind of get a grasp of at times, but a lot of the stuff seems to come down to the unions themselves. It's kind of like here, the rubbish collection is done by my local council, not by the central government. So if they're doing a crap job, it's not going to do me any good to call the government to my local MP. They're going to tell me you need to speak to your local council. It's the same thing seemingly in rugby. There's a lot of stuff that the individual unions look after. So, for example, when they asked about the revenue sharing thing from ticket sales, it's kind of like, not a bad idea, it says World Rugby, but you've got to get that past the union. Which union's going to be like, yeah, cool, I'll give some of my money to somebody else? That's a harder sell, and they might already have their own arrangements, their own contracts signed. They're doing their budgeting, their forecasting. Again, it's not as simple as World Rugby just kind of hammering that down. I don't think they have that kind of authority. He talked about the fact that voting for anything in World Rugby is done by like a weighted voting system, how the Tier 1 nations all have 3 votes, whereas the smaller, traditionally rugby nations only have 1 or maybe 1 like collectively, which was evident at the elections for chairman recently. Would a 1 nation, 1 vote system be good? And World Rugby, or at least... Brent Gosper from World Rugby, the CEO, basically doesn't think it's a fitting way to distribute the voting because the ones who are more historically connected to rugby or the ones with more money should have the more power in the voting. That one's a bit above my pay grade. I always like the idea that everyone gets the same vote, but I'm sure there's organizations around there, like I think traditionally, like there's that World Whaling Commission thing where I think it is every country has 1 vote. And like there's some like landlocked countries that are on that committee, and then we always like here in New Zealand we always hear about Japan like influencing them to relax like whaling restrictions. So I'm sure there's ways things kind of could get murky if you go 1 country, 1 vote. But at least the idea seems sensible. But I don't know. That one's again a bit above my pay grade. But when he asked Brent Gosper from World Rugby like what's the biggest problem, and he said basically keeping players in the islands long enough to get captured by their country of birth. You know what I mean? So these guys all get attracted by scholarships and whatnot abroad, so it's hard to keep them. And that's kind of where I'm feeling as well. Like there's all this talk about getting a Pacific team here in New Zealand in Super Rugby and funding and whatnot for the Pacific countries. For me, that money needs to be supporting guys who are playing rugby in these countries. Like, again, the Charles Piutau example always comes up. Bro, he's born in New Zealand and he's playing rugby in England. He's not my kind of target audience. My main thing is the guys who are playing there need more reason to stay. But yeah, it's tough, man. It's a complicated situation. But anyway, that's just kind of my take on some of the three big issues. I don't see a huge problem with changing eligibility, but I welcome any feedback on why that might be a tough one. I don't think England, New Zealand, Australia maybe are going to go broke if they were to play home games against Countries like Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa who could definitely benefit from an injection of cash. I don't see that as a deal breaker, but again, it's easier maybe said than done. Nobody's, especially post-COVID, going to want to, when they're laying off their own staff, going to want to accept any reduced incomes. Yeah, the eligibility thing, as I mentioned. It's a good watch. $5.99 US. I'm not trying to sell it to you. I'm just saying I thought it was a really good watch. They interview guys like Pat Lam, Cooper Vuna, Manu Tuilangi, Ben Ryan, the former Fiji Sevens coach, Rupini Thato-Mbuka. Hey, they did actually mention, which I kind of skipped over. I said like Samoa had like the 4 years clean bill of audit, but they did say that like a lot of positions traditionally, a few guys mentioned this, go to like friends. Like there's a bit of, what do you call that? When you give your friends or your family, like nepotism or that kind of thing. Cronyism, you know, you give people jobs because it's their turn rather than because they've earned it. That's obviously not cool. So that's one thing that the unions themselves need to get in order, right? I think it was Ben Ryan said that the Pacific unions need stronger direction from World Rugby. But again, is that World Rugby's job? If my local council's doing a crap job with the rubbish, is it the central government's job to tell them to sort that out, or is it their own problem? But yeah, Manu Tuilangi Kupavuna, Rupini Thato-Mbuka talks about how he wasted his money. Yep, it's the PM of Samoa. There's a lot of good content here. I've talked for 17 minutes about it, which is almost like a fifth of the length of the actual documentary. A third of the length of the actual documentary. Go watch it. It's a good watch. It's a bit of an eye-opener in some areas. There's some stuff which you can kind of say you already maybe knew, but it's definitely not as simple as it's all World Rugby's fault. It's definitely not as simple as World Rugby can fix everything, and it's definitely not as simple as the unions are inept and not running things well. It's none of these things. It's a combination of factors. As life tends to be, it all gets a bit grey. It's never that black and white, but I still think there's certainly things that could be done to help out. And as they mentioned, the some of the countries which have produced so many rugby players for not just these three countries, but for countries all over the world. So, yeah. Anyway, if you guys have seen it, like I mentioned, let me know what you thought of it. It is a good watch. If you haven't seen it, again, I highly recommend it. And, yeah, I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.